Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world. Whew, what a year it's been. We're only a couple weeks into it, and it is hot and heavy. We've always had a unique focus on national security, veterans issues, international affairs, the Pentagon, and all of that is front and center for America and the world. So I can think of no better guest than to bring back one of our true favorites, a returning champion, this will be the sixth time returning champion. The great and powerful Dan Lamothe is back on Independent Americans. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you, Paul.
So, how's it going, man? Wild times, huh?
Yeah, it's the hours are long, the calls are many, and we're just trying to keep on top of it.
Yeah, I mean, before we went to record, you've got some busy construction stuff happening around your house. As soon as I get ready to record, I got a moving truck that pulls up and just starts beeping the noise. I'm not moving, but somebody is. And I feel like chaos is the new normal. And, your world, especially of national security, is going to be no exception, right?
No, for sure. I mean, I think what we've seen in the first handful of days at the Pentagon is, it's not business as usual. The way things are handled, the decisions that are being made, especially early in the first Trump administration, it somewhat felt like we were somewhat shielded from the Trump politics we were seeing across the Potomac at the White House. And I mean, I think we're very much in the mix this time from day one.
So I want to get into all of it, everything from what's going to happen to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Black History Month, Iron Dome. There's no shortage of topics. But for folks who maybe haven't heard you before, in my view, you're one of the best national security reporters in the world at the Washington Post. You go back and forth from the Pentagon. So before we get into the actual issues, can you talk about your vantage point? Because I think it's so unique. I think you were there on the steps when Hegseth first came in, but over the last, let's call it 2 weeks or so, where have you been through all of this?
Yeah, I've been splitting my time between our newsroom in downtown Washington, the Pentagon itself, and my office at home. It's and honestly, it's a lot of time on the phone. It's a lot of time on text messages and signal messages and everything else. And it's trying to make sense of everything we can through as many official sources and unofficial sources as possible. I'm collaborating with my reporter colleagues who cover Homeland Security and other agencies that we occasionally collaborated with in the past, but it's very much looking like it's going to be a regular, relationship at this point. I mean, we got to be talking to the DHS side of the house on a daily basis right now.
Because they're so overlapping and integrated in a way that's never happened before? Or is it also an issue of bandwidth? Because is it all hands on deck because the zone is being flooded so much that there's so much news to keep up with?
I think there's some of that too. I mean, I think that's very obviously the strategy is, they came in with a plan to announce, 11 billion things in the first 3 weeks. So you're trying to make sure that all of the things that should deserve attention gets that attention, even if it's not the day or hour that it's announced. Some of these executive orders seem likely to have teeth and probably yield major policy changes later. Some of these executive orders are going to be hard to pull off, and sorting through what's what, and what's going to require the Pentagon policy machine to also move later. You mentioned Iron Dome. I mean, that's a discussion that's been had on and off for years. Something that Trump raised in different terminology during his first term. There is a fair discussion to have about additional missile defense and defense against hypersonics and things like that. But whether or not that ultimately looks normal or very Trumpian, I think we're waiting to see that.
So I don't want to skip past an important question I always ask every guest. I always ask them, where are you and how are you? But I want to ask you that in terms of this environment, right? Because how you are, Trump called the press the enemy of the state. You are covering these most important issues there's an attempt to elevate new news, sources that have never been elevated, like Breitbart and Daily Caller, that the White House is now putting on par with the AP and the Washington Post. But can you talk about how are you as a reporter, and what's the atmosphere like for people, especially who cover these most important issues?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of take it as it comes. Whatever it's going to be, it's what it's going to be, and I'm not going to be the only one who's struggling with that. So I kind of look at it as, okay, if they want to tamp down on access, well, I'm not going to be the only one dealing with that struggle. It's going to be frustrating, but you just do your job the best you can. The Pentagon bullpen is still open. They're still taking questions. There's still reporters walking around the building. So far, that piece of it feels very much the same. People have their opinions on Pete Hegseth as defense secretary. I would say day one, walking in the door, he took 8 questions off the cuff. They weren't easy questions. It was very awkward watching him answer whether he was going to fire the chairman of the Joint Chiefs while said chairman of the Joint Chiefs was standing right next to him, right? Like, that's a different environment, but
Yeah.
they weren't ducking us either. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be friendly. It just needs to be professional, and we'll work at it day by day.
They also weren't answering you, right? Like, I mean, they weren't ducking you, but Hegseth is skilled in a number of ways, and we see that now on full display in his ability to kind of take questions all the time and not give you any answers, right? And I think the awkwardness of all of this is really important too. But we've had Barbara Starr on the show before, who talked about how she was targeted by the Trump administration. Is there a fear of being accosted, right? Like, Jim Acosta is now out at CNN, but he's been consistently named by the president. You're at the Washington Post, which has had no shortage of controversy lately. Is there a concern among the Pentagon press corps, especially, that you will be personally singled out and identified in a way that will bring risk on you and your family?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a concern. I mean, I think it's a concern more broadly. It's not just Trump, right? Like, I've had threats that were sent to me, from other very different political backgrounds, that prompted me to call the police just out of due diligence before. So, like, yes, it's a concern. No, it's not a Trump exclusive concern. The environment is so toxic right now, and it has been for several years. I think where I'm waiting to see what happens is, so far these storylines have been pretty, exceptional in terms of like what they're doing. But in terms of the way they've been handled, you want to announce additional forces to the border, or last week, I, and along with several colleagues, had various different details of what they're considering sending to the border at the Pentagon. Those were not official press releases. That was, good, shoe leather reporting that got a lot of that. That's the kind of thing that could have gotten a backlash, could have gotten a freak out, hey, you're ahead of the process, even though you're appropriately caveating that this is not a done deal. I didn't see that, that they didn't, clamp down or freak out or anything like that. They kind of just took it, which is the way it should usually be.
Yeah.
The question will be, what happens when you've got some big scoop that they don't want out there? That's a wait and see at this moment.
Yeah. Or a big scoop that they do want out there, right? Which is now, we saw just in the last 24 hours, it looks like, the scoop about the campaign against Milley. I'm being careful of my words here. You're always a true professional. But in my view, the full frontal assault or persecution of Milley shows up on Fox exclusively, right? And that's going to be the case, I think, more often over the next couple of days. But let's rip through a couple of it. And I want to just start with the actual confirmation itself. It happened, 50-50 vote. I said it wasn't inevitable. It was the difference maker was the vice president, who, not lost on me, is also a veteran post 9/11 himself, that determined this vote, confirming another post 9/11 veteran to be the SecDef, but the most divisive vote we've ever seen. Can you talk about that vote? Because that kind of sets the stage for everything else. It's not like anything we've ever seen before in terms of its divisiveness, but can you give us your take on the vote and maybe how the Pentagon was seeing the vote?
Yeah, I think if you play this back a month or two, when Hegseth was first announced as the selection, there was a lot of questions over whether or not there would be enough Republicans. And you could kind of assume that the Democrats would be uniformly against this nominee with this background, but would Republicans kind of fall in line totally, partly? And there was like 6 or 8 names that I think people were sorting through. Where does Senator Tillis fall? Where does Senator Ernst fall? Murkowski, people like that have shown streaks of independence at times in the past. In this case, for me, as we got closer, despite all of the various scoops and all of the various baggage that was kind of combed through, I think we ended up in a spot where it became pretty clear that the numbers were probably going to be there on party lines, even if a handful of Republicans defected to get it through. Particularly once Senator Ernst came out on the record a couple, maybe 10 days ago and said, hey, I've had my questions addressed. I've met with Pete several times. He has my support. For me, that was a signal that we were probably going to get a confirmation. I found it fascinating. It was a Wall Street Journal scoop in the last day or two where Senator Tillis apparently was communicating with family members from the Hegseth family and basically encouraged the ex-wife of Pete Hegseth's brother to go on the record to describe her concerns over what she saw and told Tillis, at least the reporting goes, told Tillis what she knew. Tillis apparently told her that, this might change momentum. This might move the needle. We saw Murkowski vote against, but at the end of the day, even Tillis voted in favor of the confirmation. So it was one of those, her name's out there, she's dealing with whatever she's dealing with as a result, and not even Tillis voted against her. So,
but McConnell did, right? And this was one that I was trying. There was a question of, is Fetterman going to go with the Republicans? Was the question, right? Is Ernst going to reverse her statement? Is Tillis going to move? And then McConnell was one that I was watching throughout, right? I mean, I remember being at MSNBC and saying, watch McConnell, people kind of laughing at me because MSNBC often gets the Republicans wrong, right? But that was a really important statement from McConnell and might be a sign of how he may be more independent, especially on defense issues and foreign policy going forward. Is that, I don't think you can read enough into that. I think that's really, really important because most people didn't have McConnell on the board, right?
I've heard people say that about McConnell, that in this new post, no longer running the Senate life that he has, that he's going to focus on national security in particular, and he's going to have an independent streak. Now, a critic might say, hey, the way you handled things in the past set in motion some of these wheels.
Sure.
But he has been pretty pointed in some of his recent comments and some of his votes. I went to the Reagan Defense Forum, which is this big conference in December. McConnell was one of the speakers. He threw his weight behind Ukraine support. He raised an alarm about isolationism. It had kind of a McCain-esque feel to that.
Yep.
But the question is, you're doing that now, but not 5 years ago.
Yeah.
What's the change?
It feels like, is this a McCain moment? Is this a McNamara moment? Right? Like that's almost what it feels like in some ways, where he feels a necessity to hold the line. I mean, Amy McGrath has been on this show before. I've rarely heard her praise McConnell, but she did talk about how McConnell's always been very serious about these issues. Let's go through some of the other stuff. So he gets there the first day. This was a really important scene because that entry point, right, when you kind of walk into the building, right, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, greets you, and we get to see the kind of presentation of the SecDef. That might be what more Americans saw than the actual hearing. He walks in with CQ Brown, who has been, in their crosshairs for years, like probably on the list of like most likely to be fired. And folks ask him, are you going to fire CQ Brown? Then they walk into the building together. And then, in the span of 24 hours, it's everything from a memo that he sends saying it's DOD, not DEI. They won't talk about whether or not they're changing Black History Month. They're talking about a trans ban. They won't answer about removing CQ Brown. He starts calling Fort Bragg Fort Liberty again, right? Hegseth does, which is the old name. He starts calling Fort Liberty Fort Bragg, right? Sorry, thank you for the correction. And then you and others cover, they're sending at least 1,500, probably more, active duty troops to the border, including the 82nd and the 10th Mountain. But let's just go through a couple of those. I think it was one of the first things he sent to the force. He sent his general message, which was an echoing of the lethality thing and this kind of warrior culture thing. And then he sent something where it was literally like DOD, not like a cross in front of it, DEI. Now, I think that might have been one of the first public statements. He cranked up his Twitter again, right? He's starting to publicly communicate. Can you talk about that? And my view, this is a sign that this is the culture warrior waging culture war on the Pentagon. And what he starts with is a reflection of his priorities. And he didn't say, hey, we're going to defend Ukraine. You know, they talked about the border a little bit, but he's saying DEI is enemy number one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different feel. It's a different focus. It looks like he's going to look down and in on a lot of personnel issues. You know, someone like you and I have had conversations and, done reporting and paid attention to things like what the Army Combat Fitness Test looks like. That's not something that the Defense Secretary usually has on his short list of things to worry about. That's something that, he's tweeting about or posting on X about today, right? Like this morning, he, amplified a New York Times opinion piece that focused on that discussion.
And meaning, just for folks who don't know, there is an Army fitness test for everybody who's in the Army. There's a male one and a female one, right? And it sounds like they want to make just one.
Yeah, and they've had this discussion of how to score it and what to do with it. And I've had thoughtful discussions with people that fall all over the issue on that. Do you make it different? Do you modify different exercises? Do you score it differently? They've been struggling to figure that out for years, predating Trump. This is not a new thing, but it's going to get new attention. And I don't know what they'll ultimately decide. I imagine it's probably going to be some version of one single standard. And I think the question becomes, is it one standard for certain jobs, for any job? Like how you go about the nuance is really where it's going to get thorny.
Yeah. And I mean, this might surprise people. This is one area where I actually would be inclined to support it. I mean, it's kind of like a firefighter's test or others where there's a minimum physical criteria to do the job, regardless of gender, age, whatever else, right? And as somebody who came up in the Army myself, I would be open to that conversation if it was truly done fairly. Now, of course, the Army is trying to accommodate the physiological differences between women and men, which always, so I don't know how they're going to figure this out. And to make it a priority and to make it a Fox News conversation rather than like a scientific in-depth analysis with recommendations from a crew, it seems like the way they're going to do everything. So let's jump ahead to the other big announcement. They're sending active duty to the border. In my view, it's about optics, and it's treading on some very delicate ground that we've never treaded on before, at least recently. 10th Mountain, 82nd Airborne, looks like MP units, logistics units, engineers, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about what the latest is on these new troops that are going to the border and what else might be to come?
Yeah, I mean, so I think one point at the height of the first Trump administration, there were 8,000 active duty troops on the border. It was this weird thing that Mattis was trying to deal with. It was something that he seemed to try and work around. There was all this weird ground rules, like, hey, we'll have the MP arm, but not everybody else. You're not going to be actually interacting with the migrants. Like just a lot of very specifics. Basically, we'll support, we will work in support of the, civil authorities. This is a law enforcement mission. And a lot of the language you heard at the time. And I spent 2 days in Brownsville and McAllen in Texas, watching them string razor wire. And that's basically what the mission was trying to just put up additional obstructions. And it kind of had the feeling of, even then of a lot of messaging, right? Like a lot of show and tell, hey, we're here. But they weren't going to be kicking in doors, and they weren't going to be arresting anybody trying to cross. That was not their job at the time. This time around, President Biden had 2,500 active duty already on the border. The initial additional tranche with Trump is now boosting that from 2,500 to 4,000. Those troops are starting to arrive already. They're spread out. The Marines seem to have California. I would imagine you're going to see Army units in Texas and so forth. But then there's this additional conversation. And then I've done a fair amount of reporting on that. I've heard numbers well over 10,000, which wouldn't surprise me because if you're Trump and you're trying to show that you're doing more than you did last time, then it's probably going to be more than 8,000. The question I have is the how. What are you putting on the border? So if you're sending a brigade of the 82nd Airborne, for instance, like that's a brigade that was set aside as a crisis unit in case something popped off overseas quickly. Now they can eventually backfill for that unit, but there's that weirdness of like, okay, what if something happens a week after they go to Texas? Do they up and move? Do they send someone else? And I think those are the second and third order effects that we just don't know yet.
And what we're seeing too that is different is the flights, right? Like they're actually moving migrants out of the country on military flights. You've reported they may be deploying strikers, which are giant armored vehicles, right? And I said I wouldn't be surprised if they sent tanks down there because they look big and scary. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was a parade where he made them do a loop around all 50 states and burned an endless amount of fuel and brought them all the way back down in some kind of like, massive show of force. But it also kind of feels like a drug interdiction mission on steroids, right? Like there was always a line where they couldn't cross the border, they couldn't do actual detentions, and they kind of backfilled against law enforcement. Is there a scenario where the reporting becomes something went wrong, right? Usually that's it. Like it could be a guy falls off a truck and hits his head and dies, or somebody gets stabbed by a migrant when they're moving them, or someone gets shot and killed. There's any number of things that can happen. Is that going to force a more serious discussion, or is that just going to be considered kind of a cost of doing business when you move this many people in this kind of way? And I would ask a follow-up question too, Dan. Somebody's going to say no, right? There's going to be, the equivalent of a conscientious objector or someone who just says, I don't support this mission. There's going to be a Cindy Sheehan moment. Are you hearing anything about people saying they won't go? They won't deploy in this mission and they will instantly become famous. And, once they get out of military jail, they'll be on every news program in America.
Short answer is I think any of that's possible. We've discussed before the actual rank and file are all over the map politically themselves. Where they have their own individual, moral boundaries and quandaries. Yeah, I don't know how that falls out. I don't know who says no. I think any of that's possible. I think so long as DOD writ large can frame this as being in support, not kicking in doors in Chicago, there's probably a spot where this can find a steady state. To the question of like, what if something goes wrong? It has gone wrong before. There's a case from the 1990s where there was active duty Marines on the border back then. They misinterpreted some random 18-year-old kid who had a rifle while he was out tending a flock of sheep, and he was shot and killed by the Marines. It was a big story at the time. That story actually surfaced in some ways in a Tommy Lee Jones movie years later. And that became a big thing. And you saw the active duty pulled from the border back then in the late 90s. So I think that's in the back of a lot of people's minds. I've had that particular case come up in conversations in the Pentagon this week of like, hey, I hope we don't have a moment like that again. And then they're going to have to like really make sure that people understand their mission, make sure they understand the boundaries on that mission. And, there's a big difference. There's a lot of people moving back and forth across that border, including Americans, and including people who have family on both sides of the border who have a right to be there. And they may look like one thing to you and be something entirely different.
Yeah. If I was in the 82nd, I wouldn't be too psyched about this mission, right? You join the 82nd because you want to be a hard charger. You don't want to stand on the border in the heat and lay concertina wire for months and months. So I think the optics are a lot of this, but I don't want to focus on this stuff, but this is what they're focused on. It looks like in the first, call it 30, 60, 90 days, they're going to wage a culture war in a couple of ways. Trans ban will probably be back. Sounds like they might just not do Black History Month, right? And not recognize it, not do events like has normally been the case, for the last generation or so. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I don't think so. CQ Brown, I just want to get your thoughts on that. Is he a dead man walking? Is he out any day now, or you think they're going to kick that one down the road and it's going to be some kind of like an FBI director Comey thing where it just drags on and becomes more dramatic by the day?
I actually think he can survive at this point. I think if they were going to do it initially, they would have done it already. I think they demonstrated what they wanted to demonstrate by firing Admiral Fagan on the Coast Guard side. Um, and everything I'm hearing right now is that CQ Brown is handling this in a way where they seem okay with him. Trump also hired him as his chief of staff of the Air Force. Like, they do have history. So I think if reframed, and I mean, if you're CQ Brown, you can rightly say that, hey, I was carrying out the orders that I was given during the Biden administration. They wanted to focus on this and that. I gave my best military advice for that. I will do the same for you on these other things that you have as, priorities. And maybe that can coexist. I mean, that's sort of the General Dunford model, where he was respected pretty widely, and managed to stay out of major ugly political battles. He managed to mostly just kind of stay a bit away from the spotlight and do the job quietly. That's very different than the way General Milley handled it.
Which is, does CQ Brown become the next Milley, right? I mean, because there is an optics to this too. If Trump can get CQ Brown to be the guy who has to execute the removal of Black History Month. CQ Brown's African-American. He's a trailblazing guy. He's an inspired. I think he's incredible as a human being, but also as a leader. If you've got CQ Brown in that job, rolling back Black History Month, implementing a trans ban, changing the names of bases from, traitorous Civil War generals back to the names of traitorous Civil War. I mean, that seems like it's optically more useful for Trump than to fire him, make him a martyr, have another Milley flying around out there causing trouble. I mean, I think in some ways it's the more shrewd and maybe more effective way to approach this. But we can't talk about this, Dan, without talking about Milley. I mean, in the last 24 hours, they've announced they're removing a security detail, despite the fact that the Iranians have threatened to kill him and John Bolton and others. This looks like our political establishment at war with our retired generals, which I don't think we've ever seen before. On a very basic tactical level, this guy has a lot of secrets, right? He has a lot of military secrets, a lot of military knowledge. I mean, I don't want him shot in the streets at a Walmart, right? I don't want, some kind of crazy Back to the Future scene where the Libyans snatch him up in a van. But I mean, when you remove this man's security detail, you are exposing all of us and all of our knowledge and secrets and visibility. I know those are extreme examples, but in this environment, after the president was shot, it's not out of the realm of possibility. So can you talk about the reaction to this? I mean, it has an obvious chilling effect. They're talking about taking his star. They want to make an example out of him. Can you unpack this from your standpoint and any new reporting you can share?
Yeah. And so this is a Fox News scoop last night. It took me several hours to confirm this. And the initial public affairs apparatus did not respond. Like, we found other ways to confirm this story, which I immediately found as like, okay, this is already not business as usual. Maybe they'll get there, maybe they're still plugging in, but like, that already isn't the way it's supposed to work. Now, step away from that. The security detail is already concerned. You've got the very real discussion of, the Iranians seeking payback due to the killing of General Soleimani. That was something that occurred during the first Trump administration that Milley, seems to have agreed with, not just carried out, but seems to have been on board with. And there was a long discussion of General Soleimani and, how he had taken actions and set things in motion that did kill U.S. troops. Like, this was a fair discussion to have. The how you go about it was another piece. There's also the concern of what kind of targeting Milley might get from the right flank of America. It's one thing to criticize the guy. That's fair. But it only takes one wingnut to do something that's dangerous. And that is a very real concern they have right now. The reporting's been out there about Milley installing bulletproof curtains and so forth and so on. Like, they have real legitimate safety concerns from multiple different parties. That's going to be something they have to worry about. What I was hearing initially last night is, well, he can get his own security. And I suppose that's true, but it certainly breaks a norm. And it certainly doesn't adhere to the service that Milley did provide over the span of basically 4 decades.
Yeah, I mean, and the idea you can get your own security when you're the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I mean, yeah, there is some really great private security, but this is opening up also like so many of Pandora's boxes. And who's going to want to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs if there's a possibility that you could lose your retirement, you could be bankrupt, you could be physically intimidated, your family could be threatened. I mean, I just don't know if I can think of anything that's been this bad politically. Like the politicization of the military here is what maybe concerns me the most. And maybe that's how I want to kind of bring it all back around if I can, Dan. I mean, the challenge here is that whether Trump gets what he wants or not, he's been banging and bashing on the military for years. Call it, I don't know, 6 years, 10 years. Hegseth, the same thing. They've shit on the military for year after year. And now at least the right trusts the military less, right? The institution has been weakened, and it used to be the institution that America trusted the most. Are there any conversations in the Pentagon about the long-term effects of this? Yes, they can argue they're going to get more recruiting. Yeah, they're going to get Fox News viewers, and they're not going to get people of color who care about Black History Month. I mean, it's going to become a very narrow kind of people more than ever before. But even more so, it just feels like the military is now a political chew toy on a level we've never seen before. Can you talk about if you hear concern inside the Pentagon and what kind of concern you hear about that in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I had concerns raised with me by a retired 4-star in the last 24 hours. That was not Milley. Basically, just how did this come together? Who was basically who's behind this? They wondered whether it was the White House, whether it was the White House talking about it. And I was like, hey, top of my story, senior defense official. This is Pentagon side that is setting this in motion. Now, no doubt, President Trump is behind this, or at least standing behind this. But it does raise the concern of what's next, who's next. And there's a mix of things. They took down Milley's portrait on day one, made a big splash. I'm sure it could be perceived as disrespectful, but what was the actual tangible outcome? That was more of just a symbol. But when you start doing things like yanking a guy's security, what if the Iranians do get him? Well, just play out that as a possibility. What does that set in motion for the United States of America? Do we just take it? Do we have to do something to respond? What kind of bloodshed does that lead to? Like, there's the very real concerns there of like, what are the outcomes? And that, I think, is a discussion that they're not fully having at this most senior level. So it's kind of just like, well, they can deal with it. The discussion of whether to take a star, I found that fascinating and concerning in a couple ways. One, it's the Inspector General who's going to look at this, the Inspector General's office. That Inspector General's office is among the many that President Trump just targeted for firing. So you kind of wonder who's actually going to run this investigation. Is this investigation going to be run on the up and up? Is the payback on this investigation, the way it actually reads when there's a report to deliver to the defense secretary, is that going to be kind of a watchdog, independent sort of feel to that report? And if so, it's probably going to say things like, yes, General Milley did contact China. Yes, we know President Trump freaked out about that. However, the reporting on this previously would suggest that Milley ran that through Trump administration officials, had the blessing of the defense secretaries at the time, made 2 phone calls with coordination with other parts of the government. He wasn't freelancing this, if that's all true. In which case, you can question whether it was handled in a certain way. But if everybody signed off on this within the national security institution at the time, and Trump wants to call it treason, there's a gap there in understanding and credibility. And it would be hard for me to fire him then or demote him now in retirement if that's what you're going to base it on. What the actual outcome is certainly a question, but so is the way it's carried out.
Yeah,
and I'm concerned about the how just as much as what the final result is.
Yeah, and just the message to the world that we're going to make our family fights public, and we're not going to take care of our own. And that, I think, is the national security imperative that I think has our enemies celebrating and concerns me the most. Like the very real national security implications. He could pull Admiral Mullen's security clearance and his protection. He could pull him on all of them. And if we have all these former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs floating around While, Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson are calling their name and bombing them away in addition to the Iranians, it just leaves us exposed in my view. So Dan, let me ask you to take this also a step further. I always want to talk about what's next. A lot of people were very vocal in opposition to Hegseth, Esper, Mullen, all these former secretaries of defense, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, retired generals. What do they do now? Are they all just going to shut up and watch for a couple of months? Some of them have been on this show. I hope they'll come back. We've had Chuck Hagel, we've had General Petraeus, I've had Admiral Mullen. I hope they will come back on and tell us here. But does anybody have a plan? or is it to just wait and see? Or is there any kind of like next generation organizing where generals wouldn't normally get involved, but the stakes have become so significant that they will get involved in some way in the political discussions?
No, I wonder that myself. In terms of actions that have been taken before, you've seen groups of retired officers coordinate a letter. You've seen retired defense secretaries do the same in the first Trump administration. Do you see something like that? I don't know. Even if they did, I don't know that it would move the needle. I don't know that it would change what they're doing now. They seem to be pretty set in their ways. They seem to kind of blow a lot of that off. So I think there's a calculus that a lot of these guys have to do of like, when does it make sense for me to speak up again, particularly when I spoke up before the confirmation and the confirmation happened anyway? How long should I keep my powder dry? In what manner should I speak up again? Because if it's not going to move the needle and I'm speaking up, well, then I kind of, then I got nothing left. So I don't know where they land on that.
I think the question for everybody in America who's concerned about this is who's leading the opposition. I mean, the Democrats look feckless and strategyless and leaderless, and the generals are all keeping quiet, and there's activists and organizers and retired folks, but there doesn't seem to be a coordinated plan to fight back or hold the line even on things that are important. So I think we all have to really keep a close eye on that. Dan, let me ask you, as we wrap this up, what's most urgent that's not getting covered right now, right? I mean, we've got everything from Ukraine to the Arctic. There's now tension with Colombia, but if you were teaching a class, right, like I think you have before, on what's the most important thing that your students should be looking to, that's not getting a lot of coverage, maybe the most dangerous even, what is that? And what should we expect over the next 30, 60 days from Hegseth's travel schedule? Where's he going to go? What does he have to do? What boxes does he have to check that are spots for us to watch how he acts?
I mean, I think the short-term messaging discussion story is going to be border, right? Like if you told me Hegseth goes to the border within days or next week or whatever, yeah, that seems about right when you're spending a lot of your time and emphasis on it already messaging that. And Mattis got to the border and others got to the border in the first administration. Like if it's going to be what the administration emphasizes, then it's probably going to be what your senior appointees focus on, at least to some degree. The discussion of long-term stuff is where I think the concern remains. National defense strategy, broadly agreed to, bipartisan, retired officers, active duty, politicals from all parties, all see China and Russia as the primary concerns. The Ukraine war has not gone away. It's not on the front page the way it used to be, but it has not gone away. People are still dying every day. And we're now left wondering, what does that war look like and how does that war end? President Trump has talked about it. He's also talked about the need for NATO allies to spend more money on their own defense. There's a fair discussion to have about that stretches back. We heard President Obama have a very similar conversation back then. But what does that actual negotiation look like? What does Russia get away with or not? And the existing front line in eastern Ukraine, to what degree does that hold, particularly if ammunition is no longer going? Does it disintegrate? Does Russia at some point, able to do things they've been trying to do for a couple of years now and actually pull it off and move farther in? What does that do to NATO? What does that do to allies? What does that do to Russia's ambitions in other parts of Europe? Those are all real concerns, and those might be 2027 stories, but they're there and they're real and they're legitimate and they're grave. China is still looking to expand as well. The Trump administration has talked about China as a threat, but they are focusing a lot of short-term energy in other places. we'll see how that plays out as well.
Yeah, the first Taiwan dust up is going to be definitely one to watch. Dan, can you stick around for a couple extra questions? Just three. I want to, our Patreon members, thank you for supporting. I'm going to ask Dan a couple questions about what it's actually like inside the Pentagon that he has a unique viewpoint on. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe, spread the word, follow Dan and all of his reporting. Dan, a final question. Do you think he's going to pull troops out of anywhere? We've got small numbers of troops in places that are significant, both as a lily pad and kind of politically, Iraq, Syria, small numbers. Do you think symbolically that Trump and Hegseth will, in the short term, or have they signaled that they're going to yank troops out of a place that will be of note?
I don't know how short term, but I'll be surprised if they don't. It's what he did last time. He tried last time. Do you pull, for sake of argument, 30,000 troops out of Europe? Like those are discussions that bear paying attention. What would that actually look like? What would that leave behind? Where would you put all those people? Like those are real concerns. If you're going to send 30,000 U.S. troops home with their families, where are you putting them? So I think all of
Dan,
those
they're putting them on the border. That's where they're going to put them. They're going to put them on the border.
Right. But if you're going to bring
if you do haircuts and laundry, in the border, you're about to get a boon to your business because there's going to be a lot of troops headed your way, right? Yeah. Dan, I want to let you go because you got to run back to the Pentagon. Thank you for joining us again. Sixth time. Before you go, I got one more. I promise. This is an alibi, as we say in the military. Who's your pick for the Super Bowl? Who you got, Chiefs or Eagles? I know you're a big sports guy. You must be devastated about the collapse of your Patriots. You have, I'm sure, false hope about your Red Sox. What are you picking in the Super Bowl, man?
I'm actually going to pick the Eagles. I love the running game. I don't think this is the Super Bowl matchup that the majority of America really was looking for or excited about. Most people would have wanted to see some sort of new blood here. I think the Eagles probably have the running game to get this done. But we'll see. For me, it's kind of a toss-up game. Buffalo would have been a lot more interesting. We are where we are, I guess.
I'm with you. And in a time of disruptors, I am going to support the status quo, and I'm picking the Chiefs only because at the end of the day, in my view, it comes down to the quarterback, just like at the SecDef or the president. It's ultimately the quarterback that wins and loses games. And if I have to put money on somebody, it's hard to bet against Patrick Mahomes, who I wish was our SecDef or in government right now, to add some stability and consistency to what is a chaotic environment. Dan Lamothe, thank you for sticking around. Keep up the great work. What you do is a tremendous public service, and you're a patriot, and we appreciate all that you do and all you sacrifice to bring us this important stuff, man. Stay safe out there, and thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Stay vigilant.